Tonight, we begin with a development that European officials, NATO strategists, and foreign policy analysts had feared, denied, and quietly prepared for. A development that unfolded not over years of careful planning, but in a single strategic phase. A phase that exposed fractures inside Europe. A phase that tested NATO's unity like never before. And a phase that forced leaders to confront the limits of pressure-based strategy. What Europe, through its collective approach toward Russia, did cross a line that NATO planners and transatlantic allies had hoped would never be tested so directly. And when that line began to crack, the alliance did not pause. They responded with urgency, repositioning, and internal reassessment. For more than 2 years, there had been signals, not formal admissions, not official confessions, just persistent strategic indicators that Europe's Russia strategy was becoming increasingly unstable. Europe has been united, yes, but it has also been uneven in that unity. Its moves followed a familiar pattern, a cycle, almost a ritual. Sanctions escalate, energy ties strain, military aid increases. Political unity is declared. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Washington this year was that the ritual stopped producing results. Experts who monitor energy flows, defense stockpiles, and political cohesion know the indicators. Rising public fatigue across EU states, diverging economic pain between member countries, strains on military supply chains, and the sudden softening of once hardened rhetoric, all of that went quiet. And whenever strategic language goes quiet, it usually means disagreements are being negotiated behind closed doors. Early this year, European security and intelligence assessments detected what they described as a widening divergence in threat perception, including policy hesitations and recalibrations that had not surfaced openly since the earliest days of the conflict. These are the kinds of shifts that alliances only confront when they are signaling something very specific. Strategic exhaustion, political constraint, or long-term sustainability concerns. Observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was this. Europe was changing its strategic posture toward Russia. And when a continental alliance shifts posture even subtly, the entire security architecture feels it. The response from NATO headquarters was not ceremonial. It was not symbolic. It was not routine. It was urgent. Officials speaking after NATO summits, EU defense meetings, and bilateral consultations described Europe's evolving posture as unsustainable, politically fragmented, and perhaps most importantly, strategically incoherent, because unity depends on endurance. Pressure-based strategies only work if they are maintained over time. This time, cracks appeared. Within weeks of these assessments, NATO increased coordination messaging. Defense commitments were publicly reaffirmed. Eastern members demanded stronger guarantees. And internal debates intensified over escalation versus stabilization. These were not confidence signals. They were containment measures deployed when cohesion itself is at risk. Tonight, European policy briefings and defense analyses confirm that the strain is no longer theoretical. Europe moved before Russia could exploit the fractures. They accelerated joint procurement. They adjusted deployment postures. They increased intelligence sharing. But they also revealed fault lines. Southern Europe questioned economic sustainability. Central Europe demanded security guarantees. Western Europe faced political pressure at home. In other words, NATO targeted internal reinforcement, the component that would keep the alliance operational. This is what made leadership warnings so urgent. Europe's Russia strategy wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. It represented the kind of long-term commitment that could fracture alliances if domestic consent erodes. And NATO, understanding that fully, responded carefully. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't abandon deterrence. They didn't escalate blindly. They attempted to hold the center. Here is where the story becomes even more intense. According to critics like Yanis Varoufakis, Europe's dilemma is not about military capacity alone. It is about political economy. Varoufakis has argued that Europe attempted to fight a geopolitical confrontation with tools that distribute pain unevenly. Energy costs, inflation, industrial disruption, fiscal strain. The strategy assumed unity would endure indefinitely. Instead, it revealed asymmetry. Europe wanted to see whether pressure would force rapid change in Russia's behavior. But instead, the opposite happened. Russia adapted. Europe absorbed costs. And internal consensus began to strain. NATO did not retreat, but it recalibrated. That recalibration was so deliberate, so measured, that it sent an unmistakable signal. The alliance is no longer testing resolve, it is testing sustainability. That matters because alliances fail not from attack, but from exhaustion. As reports continued coming in throughout the year, the scale of strain became undeniable. Eastern NATO members pushed for permanent deployments. Western European governments faced growing domestic opposition. Defense industries struggled to keep pace with demand. This wasn't collapse. This wasn't panic. This was strategic fatigue. This was alliance stress testing. And stress testing is the one thing long-standing alliances rarely prepare for. For every show of unity, underlying divergence grew more visible. Remember, Europe believed sanctions would be decisive. Unity would be permanent. Pressure would be asymmetric. But tonight, the opposite is unfolding. Sanctions endure but bite unevenly. Unity persists but strains, and pressure flows both ways. What makes this moment so fragile and so revealing is that Europe's strategy is being tested during profound political vulnerability. Governments face elections. Economies face stagnation, populations face fatigue, and security planners face uncertainty. European leaders are balancing all of this while maintaining alliance credibility. And when leaders in that position make decisive moves, they're not acting from strength, they're acting from pressure. Official NATO and EU statements emphasized unity, resolve, and long-term commitment. That is alliance language for we must hold together because the cost of fracture is higher than the cost of strain. You don't hear that tone unless cohesion itself is at stake. Meanwhile, European leaders addressed their publics in carefully calibrated speeches. They spoke of responsibility. They spoke of values. They spoke of endurance. These were not rallying cries. They were reassurances from leaders aware that consent must be renewed, not assumed. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Europe's recalibration does not exist in isolation. Alongside it, the US faces shifting domestic priorities. Global South countries remain non-aligned. Economic pressures intensify across Europe, all within the same time frame. When multiple pressures converge, strategic clarity becomes harder to maintain. Analysts now see three potential paths. One, NATO cohesion holds through adaptation. Another, Europe seeks a softer strategic equilibrium. A third, alliance strain deepens into fragmentation. Today, NATO is attempting to secure the first while guarding against the third. What we are watching now is a test of alliance endurance. Europe wants stability. NATO wants credibility. Russia wants leverage. And history wants resolution. Sources say internal coordination continues. They say debates are intense. They say unity remains but no longer effortless. That alone marks a turning point. As the coming months unfold, Europe's strategy will continue to evolve. What we know now is this: the approach has not collapsed, it has not succeeded decisively, and it has revealed limits. What happens next depends on whether adaptation outpaces fatigue. And tonight, for the first time since the conflict began, Europe's strategy feels genuinely contested from within. Public rhetoric is calm, too calm. And when rhetoric calms while pressure mounts, recalculation is underway. Because tonight, NATO learned something essential. Unity is not automatic. Endurance is not guaranteed. And strategy must evolve. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Europe's Russia strategy is under strain. NATO is being tested. And the next phase will define the alliance's future. And we will be here watching every signal, every decision, every fracture, as that future unfolds.